So we had a few breakout questions on the table. The first one being, what stood out to you most about the interviews? Two, what did you think you knew about Malcolm X and prior to watching the videos? And how has what you thought you knew about Malcolm X been complicated, disturbed, disrupted, or problematized by watching the films? And then finally, what distinction can you draw between Malcolm X within the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X outside of the Nation of Islam? LJ?
Oh yeah, if it ain't a problem, I want to kind of kick off the conversation. For one, I'm a huge fan of Malcolm X, one of my heroes. With number one probably being Muhammad Ali. Um, what I will say, I guess I'll answer. I'll kind of jump into the second question. What did I know and didn't know? Personally, I'm very familiar with Malcolm X, story Malcolm X. So this information isn't new to me. I'm kind of familiar with some of his interviews. I watched the movie. I'm familiar with the book, the autobiography of Malcolm X. So, definitely a hero in the black, as far as I'm concerned, the black community. You look at the history of, black Americans. What I will say is that, discussion we had in our breakout room and with the videos presented, it reminded me, it took me back a couple of years during the beginning of the pandemic, right? I remember during it was weird times, lockdown and class morphed into this, everything virtual. One minute you're going in. So one thing that I was a professor turned me on to was the Netflix series Who Killed Malcolm X. And so I did want to share, I think, for those of you who are kind of into like binging certain shows and things of that nature, I do think that you guys would find it very, very fascinating if you were to check out the series. I'm gonna put the link in the chat. So it is available on Netflix. And what I found interesting about the series is that it kind of does like a deep dive into Malcolm X's life and some of the portrayals that was kind of mentioned a little bit in the interview that he talked about once he left the nation, and also the role that the government played, in the execution of Malcolm X, man. It was incredible. I don't know, Professor, if you're familiar with it, but it's incredible, man. Like, one of the things that Malcolm talked about in the interview is how so when he talked in the interview after leaving the nation, he talked about how, he talked about black people, harming and creating violence with other black people. He talked about Muslims doing the same thing, and he kind of, spoke about his situation with the nation a little bit, and how they want to get him, and he took the trip to Mecca. But the series, man, I recommend it, man, for anybody that's have any interest in like history and just knowing about figures, somebody such as Malcolm X, man. It casted a whole lot of, for me, it casts a whole lot of light, man, on how the FBI, the government conspired with the nation to have this man killed in cold blood, man. And then the information that kind of came out in terms of how it was done and who did it, and it kind of fast forward today, this year they kind of announced that 2 men to be exonerated that were, arrested and kind of like the scapegoats, for this murder that they didn't commit, but it served the agenda to lock them up because the FBI and the U.S. government kind of wanted them out the way anyway. So, it to me, like I said, this is very interesting. You talk about folks like Malcolm X, very interesting. It's a whole lot of different ways you go with it. But that's kind of like one of the things I want to lift up, which is things that we probably don't know. That's between the lines, right? Which is, one, his views changed, like once he left the nation, which is not even talked about. We know and hear about Malcolm the Radical, but his views did change. He became enlightened through the journey to Mecca, but also was not told the story that's not told. You're not gonna hear in high school. You're not gonna hear it in no history class, like at any of these high schools that we go to. Is that the government, the way they conspired, man, to have this man executed, just like they've done with numerous Black leaders that have kind of merged and become a voice and leader in the Black community.
Thank you, OJ. Yeah, and I put in the chat that I'll make that series for those who watch it extra credit as well, because it's a very, very comprehensive series about the happenings and the nuances behind, what got Malcolm X assassinated. Who else would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms?
I would like to share.
Okay, go ahead.
So what we talked about was the way Malcolm X was presented as a very what is it called, vicious or problematic, violenced, agreed person or advocate. But like in the interview, it says they like misinterpreted what he wanted, was that he said that he condoned violence. And it's crazy to me that white people can carry all these types of guns and not be shown or done anything. Like it's okay for them, right? Because it's part with their right. So when a black person, when a non-white person goes and does that, it's like the end of the world. Their rights are taken out, or just inhumane responses, because they're so used to seeing white supremacy above anyone else. So I see why people, mostly white people, would tell him that he condoned vicious acts of violence or whatnot, which was pretty interesting how it just comes and plays out that a person, a numerous amount of hate crimes won't or will not be enough for someone to act upon those like hate crimes. And then when someone decides to speak up about it, someone tries to advocate about it or do something about it, they're in the wrong. Yeah. Something.
Thank you, Liz. You're talking about the contradictions of who and how violence could be used. That's spot on.
Yeah, like the hypocrisy, I think it mentions it as well. The hypocrisy of like, how can someone have the same, while they have the same rights, but how is it that one person can use it much more than the other, or like it's wrong for them to use it against like the same crimes or the hate crimes that they're getting done to.
Yep. Thank you. Let's get one more and then we'll move into my notes.
I can say something. So for our group, we pretty much talked about what Lizette said as well. Like during the interview, I forgot which one, if it was one or two, but how the interviewer was being hypocritical in terms of how he was trying to say Black people are being so violent, even though he was saying they're not, that they're being violent, but Malcolm was saying they're being violent they have to use violence because violence is being used against them. And he couldn't understand that aspect. And I thought that was pretty interesting because not that I think this way, but I know a lot of people think that Malcolm X used violence. He promoted violence against white people, which is why he was saw as a threat. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And like, I believe the second question, in terms of what we thought, what I thought about Malcolm and how society has seen Malcolm to be, is just a violent person versus protecting our culture from violence. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Armani. Perfect. All right, so I'm gonna jump into my notes. And like LJ, and I think due to like our age similarities, right? The affinity that we have for Malcolm is highly influenced by the work of Spike Lee, the film that was put out, I think in '91, I believe, was the film Malcolm X. And just kind of thinking about back to that time, right? I was familiar with Malcolm X. I knew who Malcolm X was. His likeness was familiar to me, but I remember going to the Magic Johnson Theater on Crenshaw to watch the film, and not only like the people's responses to the movie, like in the moment, right? Like the cheering and all of those things, but also like the conversations that kind of lingered outside of the theater. You kind of like, because I'm like, I don't know, maybe like 9 or 10 when the film came out, but you kind of like hear the old folks talk about the importance of Malcolm. And I think also seeing the film at the Magic Johnson Theater also had a different, added a different like element to it, right? So yeah, I agree, LJ. Like one of my favorite ancestors for me is Malcolm X and Kwame Ture. And I think about, if you think about a couple of readings ago when they say, and they mentioned how the Black Power movement calls for a shift in the way that Black manhood was viewed. And in fact, it argues that they did not have an understanding of Black manhood until the Black Power movement. By and large, that depiction stems from Malcolm X, right? And there's almost a bifurcation, if you will, when you're thinking about Black liberation theology, when you're thinking about Black radical thought and Black radical tradition. Is like two pathways, if you will. One of them goes through the likes of Martin Delany, George Pattermore, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, et cetera, right? The other ones would be like your Booker T. Washington, some forms of W.E.B. Du Bois, especially the earlier parts of his life and his career, right? And then it will go through the Martin Luther King Jr.'s and these types. So that's like the split that they placed between the Black radical tradition, right? So as we know, Malcolm X occupies this so-called radical thought class, right? Liz, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, it's like super out of like the topic of like Malcolm X or whatnot. Throughout this weekend that just passed, my sister was brutally beaten by a group of females and males at a party, and going back to like using self-defense or whatnot, it was just a one-on-one like altercation that happened, but then that girl's family jumped in, started beating my sister. She was already on the floor with no type of like defense she could use. And I was just thinking about the Malcolm X, like we press charges, whatever already, like the system is working on it, but like they're pretty much saying that that to an extent of fighting, it was okay for a group of people to like brutally hit my sister, and no charges should be made. So there's, yeah, like how are you supposed to just sit there, get beat, and like not press charges whatsoever? So I was thinking about that, like how is it that this girl has a right to hit my sister, and like her family has like the right to like a group of like her family like obviously hit my sister, and it's not okay for her to like use the justice system to obviously make justice for her? And so I was just thinking about that right now when we were speaking.
Yeah, I'm confused as fuck. Like I heard what you said, but I'm trying to process what you said like from a rational standpoint, and I can't, because I don't like, how is it? It's one thing if it was like a one-on-one fight, right? And then lost the fight, then I can see how they could be like, well, she lost the fight. But once you get jumped, that's kind of, and I want to say there's some type of provisional law when it's used to things like kicking someone on the ground and using other objects in a fight. That's a whole nother level of legality. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't know, but I just think about my high school and some of the situations that I've been in, and that's kind of came up where you start to use your feet and other objects, that turns into a whole nother level of conversation. Is your sister okay though?
Yeah, thankfully. Well, I mean, she had a busted lip, like nose, some fractures on her ribs, and like nothing like major, but like obviously it was like hurting her. Yeah. Not to like a really bad extent that she can like, well, she was in coma or whatnot, but yeah, she said like several I think about like 8 girls fought her, and like 3 guys started fighting her too. Like she was on the floor, and like people were kicking her, punching her, and like whatever, and like no one did anything about it. So
yeah, that's crazy. That's one thing I learned in my upbringing. If you're getting jumped, find a wall and put your back against that wall and let your hands just go to work. That's the only solution you have when you're getting jumped. Yeah, I hate to hear that though, Liz. I hope your sister kind of bounces back. Yeah, so kind of, I'm lock in step and key with LJ in the sense of the reverence that I have for Malcolm. But to get to the interviews and the reason why I kind of position them in like the pre-NOI Malcolm and then the post-NOI Malcolm is you do see a very distinct difference. And for me, because I'm a very astute fan of Malcolm, like if you even look at his facial expressions when he's younger, you can kind of see him like look at like this motherfucker. He has those type of looks on his face, right? You can see his frustration, you can see his anger, right? All justified, right? Like you have the right to be frustrated, you have the right to be angered, especially when you think about the way that they try to belittle him within their questioning and things of that nature, the smugness that they ask the questions, right? But then when you get to the post Nation of Islam Malcolm, there's a peace about him. And you can tell while the frustration kind of bubbles up, he's able to reduce that frustration and go into, addressing the question how he sees fit. Another thing that I've always been attentive to with Malcolm pre-Nation of Islam and Malcolm post-Nation of Islam, there's a physical difference, right? He looks different. While in the Nation of Islam, he's clean shaved, right? But once he gets outside of the Nation of Islam, he has a beard. And for me, I've always was struck by when he returns from Mecca, and one of the reporters asked him, is there a significance in your facial hair? And his response is, being abroad, I picked up that, we need to start kind of looking like our African people across the Atlantic, and my beard and me growing the facial hair is a reflection of me trying to embody the African people who I was in conversation with while I was outside the United States, right? So these are some of the distinctions that I'm able to draw listening to Malcolm while he was in the nation and then outside of the nation. But if we think about our course, right, the Manhood course, and how the conversations within the interview intersect with this notion of manhood, for me, there's we call it, when I do my rites of passage work in the summer, I always tell the young men that there's the 4 P's of manhood, right? You're a priest, you're a prophet, you're a protector, you're a provider. Those are the 4 P's: priest, prophet, protector, provider. And so I want to focus on that 3rd P, the protector, right? And Malcolm as a man is very grounded in this idea of being the protector, which brings to the question, right? Nonviolence and violence, right? How to legitimize violence and how to delegitimize violence. And then also the role of the civil rights movement and their stance of nonviolence, right? What is Malcolm's thoughts around that and things of that nature? Also some themes that you find within the interviews. I'm thinking more specifically the first one with the brother who is so the first one has 3 people on this panel, right? It's the Black dude who's serving the purpose of, who Malcolm, and then the white interviewer, right? So I'm thinking about that one. Also this notion of the role of the white liberals as advocates for African organizations and being suspicious of their involvement with these organizations. And I love how he articulates whiteness view of violence, right? And he says, really, the white fear of violence is the guilty consciousness of the white body and their fear of African retribution, right? Or their fear of African people getting their get back. So this is really what the whole paranoia around violence stems from as it pertains to Malcolm. And I kind of mentioned this, right? Like, there's a smugness in the questions that are being asked by the white interviewer, but then like there's a very clear agenda by the Black interviewer, right? And he's really seeking to ask questions that will force Malcolm to respond in a way that he can be positioned as irresponsible, violent, radical, et cetera, right? He's always trying to like point out some seeming contradictions that Malcolm made, right? And he notoriously fails out trying to point out those contradictions. I also love the metaphor of likening the fox to the liberal, right? And he says, like, you know, the fox is always going to be friendly to that lamb, to make that lamb a lamb chop, right? And he says this is the work that the white liberal does as well. Malcolm also does a very clear job of distinguishing between what they call the Negro leaders, but what Malcolm more effectively calls the Negro puppets, right? Because he says that these people are not, in fact, leaders. These are people who are placed in positions of leadership by the power structure, right? And then he says, you know, the question arises as what is causing, and they invoke James Baldwin. And it says, you know, Baldwin writes about how he was walking through the streets of Harlem and he would hear the soapbox preachers. And if I can kind of take a quick detour into that time in Harlem and what Baldwin is accounting for, right? In the 60s, 50s and 60s, this soapbox type of preaching was very prevalent. And what would happen is they would just set up on, I'm trying to think, 108th Street, I believe, is one of the major streets that was set up. And there's another Lomax, I believe it was, would be the cross streets. And they would just get like either ladders or soapbox, stand on top of them and just give speeches, right? And you would have the Black Christians giving speeches. You would have the Hebrew Israelites giving speeches. And then you would have the Nation of Islam. And what Baldwin is saying, at a specific time, no one was paying any attention to the Nation of Islam. But as time went on, Baldwin started to be more attentive to the fact that the congregation that gathered in front of the Nation of Islam, in particular Malcolm X, would grow larger and larger. So the question arose, what do you feel attributes to the growth and popularity of the Nation of Islam within the Black community, in which Malcolm responds, right? It's the economics, the political, and the social conditions that are making African people be more attentive to the work of the Nation of Islam. And I liken that to our summer of 2020, right? Everything that was going on in the summer of 2020, the lockdowns, the actual COVID itself, right? And then all of the protests happening in the street because of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd's murder, it caused people who were not politically conscious to be more politically conscious, right? And one of those individuals being my pops. My pops was not ever a really political individual, but seeing what the government, with this country, with this nation was doing, forced him to be politicized. Now, mind you, he grew up in the house with me, and I've been political since I could remember, right? And I was very, sorry, I got 2 calls from individuals that's kind of normal, so I'm thinking something happened. But anyway, so the political conversation and the political nature was always in the home because I lived in the home, right? But it wasn't until the summer of 2020 and all that happened that the light went on in my pops. And this is what Malcolm is saying also. This is why the Nation of Islam grew so much popularity, because of the social conditions of African people. And then I also love this idea when talking about equality, that white folks aren't the measuring stick for how we want to view our equality, right? We want to be able to tap into our dormant potential, Malcolm says, and the ability for us to establish our own heaven. And I love that. So one thing, if you've read the autobiography of Malcolm X, he talks about how he developed his style of discourse, his style of argumentation, and he likens it to the martial arts jujitsu. And one of the things of jujitsu is you're going to use your opponent's weight against them, right? And if you pay attention to Malcolm's discourse and the way that Malcolm handles questions, he is phenomenal at turning the question against the person who poses the question. And a perfect example of that is when the notion of Zionism gets brought into the conversation. Who is not familiar with Zionists? Who has not ever heard of that or doesn't know what the whole political philosophy of Zionism is? Okay, so we all understand. Okay, so for those who don't understand, so Zionism is the political ideology and philosophy that stems from what we might think of the white Jewish community, right? That allowed them to occupy and colonize the area of Palestine. And I'm using this verbiage very specifically, right? So the idea is because Jews received persecution at the hands of Germany, that they should be able to establish a homeland for them to kind of rebuild themselves, right? So mind you, Eastern European Jews are being persecuted by Germans, okay? So keep in mind the locality of what we're dealing with. This is Europe, right? So because of this, an individual by the name of Theodor Herzl, who is one of the foremost proponents of Zionism, says that the area of Palestine should be Jerusalem, right? So because of this, these Zionists, these Israeli Jews go in, invade Palestine, and take over Palestine, right? But the whole Western world backs the movement of these European Jews to take over this Palestinian land, okay? So this is this idea of Zionism, right? I do want to make a very clear distinction. White Jews are not all Zionists, right? There are some white Jews who have vast problems with the operation and the political philosophy of Zionism, who disagree with the illegal occupation of Palestine, right? Which they call Israel, okay? But the interviewer asked Malcolm about the Zionist idea, because remember, Malcolm's and the Nation of Islam's philosophy is complete separation from the white race, right? Whether it be allowing us to go back to Africa and establish our own homeland there, or carving out some, I think it was about 8 or 9 southern states to establish their own Black enclave within the Americas, right? So this is the program and the platform of the Nation of Islam, which prompts the interviewer to ask him about Zionism, right? To which Malcolm responds using his verbal jujitsu, right? It's interesting how the white world is able to fall behind this white Jewish population to go forward and colonize a brown country, Palestine. But here you are to ask me about the Black world trying to establish our own place to live, right? We're not doing that at the behest of colonizing white folks, right? We're just trying to establish our own independence. But you want to come to me talking about Zionism and Zionism, right? So again, the ability to use the words of his enemy against them, right? That's that jujitsu. LJ, you had a question?
Well, you know, I was gonna make a quick point to kind of support what you was just saying. So another thing that came up too as well, I don't know, Professor, if you're familiar with, so the reporter you're talking about is Mike Wallace.
Yes.
Right, anybody know anything about Mike Wallace, man? He's dead now, but he was a CBS reporter, white, arrogant, condescending. So he has a very like arrogant, smug interviewing style. And so I know a couple of years ago, this is an old interview, but there's actually an interview that he did with Farrakhan. Mm-hmm. Right, I don't know if you saw it, but he was talking crazy about Nigeria, right? And so in the breakout group that we just had, I was explaining how same thing, right? He was trying to talk down on Nigeria, a newly formed country, and you know, Farrakhan checked him and said, like, who are you to talk about a corrupt country when your people have gone and done this across the world? So just to speak to your point, like you said, Malcolm, you know, very, you know, in a savvy way, kind of used that, you know, that very savvy verbal jujitsu, and Farrakhan is another person as well. He's great at it, masterful. And you know what I'm saying, you talk about people like Mike Wallace and other people, because to me, Mike Wallace is representative of like, you know, a lot of white people, maybe even some of these Zionists that you talk about. But again, it's you know, it's always people who are the oppressor or the colonizer, like in this case with Mike Wallace, our descendant, who actually got the nerves to point fingers and try to shame people, which is why I got chills looking at that video, man, that interview, that clip. I got chills. He checked that dude, man, and I was just, and you talk about like having something to kind of lean on. I'm like, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Like, who are you to talk about a corrupt country and, you know, try to, you know, put this narrative on the nation, violence and things like that. Like, everything you've done, or everything your people represented comes from violence.
I think the exact phrasing that Farrakhan used was, "You are in no position to be the moral authority on corruption, when you are in fact the most corrupt country on the planet," is what Farrakhan says, paraphrasing. But this idea of being the moral authority is central to Farrakhan's argument. And in fact, Farrakhan learned this argumentation style from Malcolm. If you are familiar with the autobiography and a lot of historic literature around the nation, this individual, Louis 13X, I believe, was Louis Farrakhan, right? And he evolves from the 13X to earn the last name Farrakhan, who was a disciple of Malcolm. And unfortunately, you see the same kind of thing that played out between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm play out between Farrakhan and Khalid Abdul Muhammad some 30 years later in the 90s. Let's see. So we talked about, okay, boom, that's actually right on track. So Baldwin makes a reappearance, right? And the black dude is trying to say that the Nation of Islam is not as popular within the black community as the civil rights movement and their leader, Martin Luther King. But Malcolm uses the words of Baldwin, who says that, you know, the Nation of Islam is the real grassroots movement within the black community, right? Whereas the celebrities and the so-called spokespeople will speak to the civil rights movement, the everyday black folks, the quotidian black folks within the hood, they're aligning themselves with Malcolm and his work, which also provokes Malcolm to give a very staunch critique of celebrity. And I think he's one of the first people within our intellectual tradition to have a really, really spot on critique of the black celebrity and the role of the black celebrity to be manipulated and to manipulate the black masses. And if we are to take that critique and apply that to our current now, we have no black leaders, we have only black celebrities, right? And in fact, it's gotten so bad that we conflate the two, right? I love Jay-Z's evolution, right? I love how he's went from where he started to where he's at now. And you could tell he has a heightened level of political consciousness. And you also see that reflected in his wife. I think, in fact, the wife probably gave him a lot of his political consciousness. But as much as he evolved, I'll be a fool to equate him with the likes of Malcolm X, right? The political astuteness and the on-ground work is not there. He's a celebrity, right? And thank you, LJ. And more than anything, a capitalist, right? So we have to do a better job as people, as the masses, to shift through celebrity and leadership. And I think that this problem within our community is emblematic of a larger Western world and American particular problem, right? We give celebrity too much credit. And then he kind of gives this idea that, right, those who know about the Nation of Islam won't tell, and those who tell about the Nation of Islam don't know, right? And then the post-NOI interview, I'll move through that pretty quickly, right? This idea of blood brothers. And he says, you know, all Black folks are blood brothers. He's very specific with how he addresses that question, right? And he's not going to say he knows what's going on, but he's also not going to devalue them or take away from the work that they're doing, right? He's saying, I support them and I support the work that they do, but I ain't gonna give you no information. I'm not a fool. I look like talking to the enemy about the workings of those who seek to bring your system down, right? So this just shows you the political astuteness of Malcolm, right? He asked the people, you know, so this question of arming the Black community, this question of forming rifle club is very prevalent in Mike Wallace's questioning, right? And he says, well, America is spending over $50 billion on defense. So it surprises me that you would be up in arms about African people forming rifle clubs, right? We talked about how this is a byproduct of frustration, so I'm gonna go into that. And again, kind of go back to Mike Wallace, right? And if you're very attentive to how he phrases his questions, they all seek to place any potential violence that would ensue on the hands of Malcolm X, right? So would you be willing to be the leader of such movement? Are you advocating for violence to come in this upcoming summer, right? So everything that Mike Wallace asked was to place the ownership and impetus on Malcolm for inciting these type of acts of violence, right? And I'm gonna end it with this. And I think this is a very, very brilliant argumentation made by Malcolm. White folks have lost the ability to be objective when it comes to analyzing violence, right? And it could be due to their guilt, right? Or due to their desire not to give up power. They have lost the ability to be objective. And I'm gonna give you an example of that using the scenario I gave you earlier about Zionism, Israel, and Palestine. If you look up, I would argue if y'all go to put in Palestine to a Google search engine, probably within the second page, you'll see an image of a Palestinian child throwing a rock. I almost guarantee you, if you type in Palestine or Palestinian in Google, within the second page, you'll see an image of a Palestinian child throwing a rock, okay? This is where, and I'm gonna make this make sense, give me a second. So I've already told you about the dynamics of Israel and Palestine, but what I didn't talk about were the Palestinian people who feel like their land is being taken from them, which it is, right? And their ability to maintain their sovereignty on their own land, their freedom on their own land, to maintain the rights of their own land, right? And while you may see that Palestinian child throwing a rock, what you may not see is that Palestinian child is throwing a rock at a tank. He may be throwing a rock at an Israeli soldier who has riot gear and submachine guns and things of that nature, right? You may not see the bombs that Israel will drop on Palestine, right? So right now, America is trying to mitigate war crimes of Russia and Ukraine, but they don't say shit about the war crimes that Israel conducts on Palestine for over now 50 years, right? And we don't even have to go global. We could take this domestic. They say nothing about the war that they impact on African people within the confines of the Americas, right? But if we are to go back to this image of the Palestinian child throwing the rock, right? They will position that child as being irresponsible, as being violent, as being reckless, but they'll legitimize the tank that that child is throwing the rock at. So again, how do you compare a rock to a tank and classify the rock as the one who's violent, but not the tank? And this is the spot on example of whiteness. We don't even have to put it to people, whiteness's of inability to be objective as it pertains to acts of violence. Liz, I seen your hand go up for a moment. And LJ, is your hand back up or is it just the same hand?
My hand was up. I just wanted to add on the what you're saying, that like obviously they're gonna pretty much see the way to victimize themselves and go ahead and lead on to like the media propaganda, because as soon as like we found out that there was a war going on, everyone rushed and like said, oh well, like this part is like to blame, this part is a victim. But like I honestly didn't like get involved in it until I asked one of my professors, like, hey, can you go ahead and enlighten me about this whole situation? And I understand that it was just media propaganda, that it was just like how someone victimized themselves as well, these are the wrongs and these are the rights. So I mean, I like where you were coming from, Professor.
Thank you, Liz. I'm gonna go to you, but I'm looking at the chat, and Ryan put that U.S. is constantly aiding Israel. Another thing for y'all to look up, two, I'll give you two. One, look up how much money that the United States pays the Israeli defense budget. how much money the United States pays Israel for their defense budget? And two, how much money did the United States pay Israel in reparations? Look those things up and come back to me. And then think about this conversation around the United States' inability to pay African people reparations. LJ? Nothing? Okay. Cool. Shit, we kind of went long on time. I'll just open it up to any other questions, comments, or concerns that we have with the remainder of the time that we have left. Any other questions, comments, or concerns?
I just had a quick a statement. They are now bringing back the demand for reparations for African Americans. I, however, feel like it's a cause and it's an effect. It's like, why are you giving it to us all of a sudden after Jewish people got theirs, after all of these other races and religions got theirs? But it's like, what are you gonna do about it, you know? And then I know there was talks of giving back the motherland, quote unquote, to Black descendants on ancestors that owned it. But it's like, at what cost? Because it's like I said, I wholeheartedly believe if we came together right now and made another Black Wall Street, I feel like the same thing would happen, or there would be a lot of coons. If you don't know what that is, people that turn on their people for any little amount of something. And I honestly feel like the revolt would be good because on the weekends I do canvassing, and to know how many people of like my mom's age, my Nana's age, are so unwilling to vote and saying, well, I made this much when I was growing up, so everyone else has to suffer. Or Republicans have too much money, so it's never going to change. And it's like, there's so many people like you that think that if you don't go out there and vote or even say something that it can actually change. But there's a lot of people like you that don't feel like, oh, if I don't vote, it's not going to make a difference anyway. But that's why they're so afraid of us voting and getting out there, is because we can make a change. That's the problem. But I just wanted to say that.
I'm going to complicate that a little bit, Cherie, as far as the voting aspect. Because who are you going to vote for to make that change would be the question I would pose. Because I would argue that a lot of us voted for drunk ass Kamala to be in office. A lot of us voted for coon ass Obama to be in office, right? And I know y'all like, hey, damn, Obama coon. But I'll ask you this question, right? To be the highest ranking officer in the country, right? And to be able to achieve that title by and large because of half of who you are is Black, right? I think you owe some type of responsibility to the community that produced you. And somebody tell me if I'm wrong, but African people's material conditions did not change under Obama's leadership. In fact, the Black Lives Matter movement was birthed under Obama's leadership because of the constant killing of the Black body, right? So my question as it pertains to the vote, how does it really change? I'll say, if anything, it would be more impactful at the local level, but at this large scale national level.
Yeah, no, that's what I meant. Like, you know, just as far as like community changes, as far as voting for propositions. Okay. No, I didn't mean like major people, because honestly, that's not gonna happen, because it's like the ghetto is still the ghetto before and after. And it's like at this point, there honestly, I like have no faith in any of the people, because we still have superior judges still judging from like 1920, 1800. Like, that's ridiculous. And the world doesn't even revolve like that anymore. Like, it's come so progressive. But no, I meant like small, like very small, but it's still like the knowledge and the knowing that, you know, as long as you're registered to vote, it's like you're still doing things that other people got taken away. Like, as far as like the inmates who actually practice, like Malcolm X, for example, I read his book in high school, and his findings from the Nation of Islam was in jail, where he would read the books and study it and things like that. So there's just a lot of knowledge out there that a lot of people don't know, and then the older generation don't really care. but yeah, no, I didn't mean, there's no one out here seriously that would even help us out. Like, yeah.
Okay, let me see. Real change comes from the bottom up. That's why the white liberal feared Malcolm, even after his pilgrimage from, in my opinion, yep, because he understood the power of the collective. I completely agree, Ishmael. He attached himself from the masses because that's who he came from, right? Like, we talk about Malcolm, but don't forget Detroit Red, right? Because Detroit Red was from the streets. Detroit Red was a hustler. Detroit Red was a pimp, right? So we cannot divorce that from who he is. Looking at Lanisha, the judge in the Supreme Court, they don't change. Okay, hold on. So this just real quick, I know we're short on time, but I want to bring that this newly appointed Supreme Court judge to the conversation real quick, only to shift that conversation to a post that the New York Post made as it pertains to her election. I don't know if anybody came across that, but anyone knows who, I think Ketanji Brown is her name, who her husband is?
He's a white man.
Okay.
I think he's like a professor or a lawyer or something like that.
Yes. Okay. So do you all know what the New York Post article was? I'm going to a pilgrim. Does anyone know what the New York Post article was that pertained to Ketanji Brown and her husband? Anybody see that? So the article is arguing that more Black women should look into marrying white men because of the support that this pilgrim showed to his Black wife, right? So I want y'all to think about the implications for that as it pertains to, one, the Black family, as it pertains to two, Black manhood, right? And as it pertains to three, the dynamics of relations between Black men and Black women, right? So we'll leave it with that. For next week, and if somebody has a comment or a response to that, feel free. I'm just going to show y'all what we get into for next week. Okay, so we're doing interviews going forward for the rest of the semester. We're going to jump into Tupac next week. So if you could do it chronologically, it would make more sense. So this is him in high school. This is him prior to going to prison. And then this is him towards I think this is actually last interview. So if you can work that way, and then we'll have a conversation about that. And then from there, we'll go into Nipsey Hussle, someone more contemporary. But the way that I'm thinking about this is a triangulation between Malcolm, Pac, and Nipsey as these very specified depictions of manhood, right? And so you kind of think about that as you watch these interviews. Again, Pan-African Film Festival, that's extra credit. The Tupac Pop-Up Museum downtown across the street, diagonally from Staples Center, that is extra credit. And the Who Killed Malcolm X documentary on Netflix is also offered as extra credit. If you guys have any other questions, comments, or concerns, always reach out to me. I'll be happy to address those.